Hello, everybody. I'm Saskia Feast. I'm going to be moderating this panel on this webinar on understanding REDD+ projects and how they work. It's exactly 4 p.m. or 8 a.m. here, so I'm going to give it 1 minute, but then we have a lot to review and discuss, so we're going to start promptly. Okay, for people just joining, I'm Saskia Feast. I have the pleasure of hosting this webinar with our technical experts. I'm going to start at 1 minute past. 1 minute past. I see the timer has just got there. So thank you all for joining us today. This is a hot topic. We have over 150 clients and prospects who've registered to understand REDD+ projects and how they work. If we could go to the next slide. I have the pleasure of being joined by our expert panel. Here we have Valerie Morgan, who's the head of our Nature-Based Solutions Technical Project Development team. Valerie has over a decade of experience in NBS. She's one of the most gracious technical experts I know, calmly explaining complex and nuanced details of these projects, having spent a lot of time in the field. And as I was just getting to know her more deeply, I realized that she's studied in Lille, in France, Moscow in Russia, Fuda in China, Arizona, Michigan, and Cambridge in the UK, Bangor and LSE. So a lot of extensive experience. So thank you, Valerie. We're looking forward to hearing more about the REDD experience that you have. And then Eddie Melendez, who also has extensive experience. Both of them actually lecture on complex topics around environmental and chemical sciences. His skill is really being able to synthesize extremely detailed and complex information. So clients, many of you might have actually had him come and join some of our calls on a deep dive in a particular project. And he's also on the ground, both writing PDD, but Eddie is on the ground in Guatemala with one of the flagship projects, a cookstove and water filtration project that we work with. Before I hand over to them, let's just look at the next slide. Oh, and I'm Saskia. I'm the managing director of the Global Client Solutions team. So normally based in the west of the US in California, but this week working in the UK with our team. A couple of housekeeping items. So the audience is going to be placed on mute throughout the duration of the webinar. You can click on the Q&A icon underneath at the bottom of the screen and put in your questions. We have allocated time to answer questions from the chat. And if we don't have time, we're going to be making sure that those questions are followed up by your client account manager. And we are recording the webinar. So without further ado, let's go on to what we're going to do. I'm going to do a very, very brief overview of REDD+ and why it's needed. And then we're going to go deeply into how the projects work and are evolving and address head-on some of the challenges and criticisms and walk you through our conclusions and then get on to your questions. So next slide, please. Why do we need REDD+ projects? Well, I think, as you all know, as we deal with the global challenge of moving our economy to net zero, we have to conserve nature and enhance it. Everybody on this call and the majority of our clients, we're all working to support the drive to 100% renewable energy. We're working to reduce our own emissions to the extent that we can. We're trying to deal with air travel emissions and manufacturing production emissions. And at the same time, a cost-effective thing that we can do is support nature through conservation projects such as REDD+. So we know that forests account for 31% of total land area, and about half of that are tropical forests. They also represent an irreplaceable stock of biodiversity. There are multiple crises all coming to a head at the same time. More than 96% of deforestation is human-caused permanent removal of the forest occurs in the tropics. And the land use change and forestry sector is accounting for up to 15% of global emissions in 2019. So this is from the Global Forest Resources Assessment in 2020, the FAO.org. So how do we finance the conservation? How do we keep the trees in the ground? This type of project came around about 15 years ago, and it's really about competing with the drivers of deforestation and forest degradation, putting a financial value on them so that the communities that live in, on, and around these forests are incented to conserve and enhance these forests, developing other sustainable practices. So let's go on to the next slide, please. Fundamentally, the goal of every REDD+ project is to reduce the emissions from deforestation and forest degradation and enhance sustainable management of forests. If you look on the right side here on this graph, the idea is that there is the pink line. Over time, there are increasing emissions as the forest is cut down. The drivers of deforestation are large-scale agriculture, commercial farming, palm oil or other areas, and also small community deforestation over time, degradation, as the communities that live there need to support themselves and their growing communities. So these are some of the drivers of deforestation and forest degradation. In a REDD+ project, you estimate that deforestation rate, and you say, actually, we're going to put a project in and we're going to count what has not been deforested or degraded. So the amount of tons of CO2e that have been reduced from implementing that project. And we'll issue those according to a standard. And then the payment of that will be used to counteract the other drivers. So to stop the deforestation, to support the community in developing sustainable practices. Sometimes there are cook stove projects, so efficiency in using of biomass in those project areas, and to think about sustainable crop growth. So a lot of the questions here are, is that baseline emission from the historic data and that projection into the future accurate? You're all business people. Businesses are doing forecasts. Every year we're doing budgets and we're planning into the future, and we constantly have to check those forecasts and make sure that they're based on reality. And that's one of the things that we're looking at here with REDD projects. If we could go to the next slide, please. Not only do we have then just that carbon quantification, but you have all of the co-benefits. So REDD+ projects protect the forests and the biodiversity within them, as tropical rainforests are both precious carbon sinks and biodiversity hotspots. Many of these projects are incredible locations around the world. And then the last slide for me is at the community benefits of these projects. I touched on this before, but this is really about providing economic livelihood that supports the conservation and protection of these critical biodiversity locations by supporting the community, by providing them sustainable livelihoods and economic opportunities. In fact, REDD+ projects, with all of their complexity, so thinking, we're sustainability people, so we have to think in systems. And a REDD+ project is an example of a great system providing the finance to support not only the rainforest, but also the finance to protect the communities and give them access to efficient tools for developing their own livelihoods. So one REDD+ project, I think it's only REDD+ projects who have actually received positive grading on all 17 of the UN SDGs. So these projects are about carbon primarily, that's what you're financing, but they're also about achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Hopefully, I didn't want to take too much time. That's a very quick summary of what we're dealing with here. This is one of multiple offset methodologies. There are many different offset registries. Vera is one, and they've really pioneered this methodology for REDD+. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Valerie to describe how REDD+ has evolved.
Thanks, Saskia. I think, for us, the way we wanted to approach it is to give an overview of REDD, its history, but also give an overview on the kind of the technicalities of REDD, so that you have the tools that are needed to kind of have a general understanding of REDD+, so that when there are different criticisms that do come to light, you have a really broad understanding of the different jargon and the complexities that come with REDD. So that was really where we're coming from today. And so when we're thinking about doing this this webinar, we really wanted to go over the history of REDD+, just to contextualize a bit the role in which voluntary markets play in forest conservation. The concept of REDD+ actually originated in the Global Climate Accords, even though the idea to avoid deforestation as a means to fight climate change, rather than only planting new trees, originated by ecologists, as early as the 70s and 80s, with pilots of this kind of showing varying levels of success. But it was really in 2005 at the COP11 in Montreal when Papua New Guinea and Costa Rica proposed to protect their forests, but only if developed countries helped finance that protection. So this kickstarted negotiations on incentive structures and rules for finance of this type that lasted for the better part of a decade and was adopted in the Warsaw Framework in 2013. And so interestingly, the Warsaw Framework recognizes the role of voluntary credits for REDD+ implementation as another means to get carbon finance with extra layers of verification, basically. And so all of these negotiations were happening in the backdrop of an emerging voluntary carbon space, which essentially stemmed from the Clean Development Mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol that was quite innovative. It allowed countries to basically implement an emission reduction project in another country as a means to meet their Kyoto targets in exchange for a certified emission reduction. And so why am I talking about this? Why is this important? Is because this sparked the private actor interest to participate in carbon markets and to contribute to reducing emissions and not just leave it to the government level. So there was a demand for increased quality assurance on these credits, of course, because they're private actors that wanted to ensure that the contribution that they were providing was not just carbon orientated, but also had sustainable livelihoods, biodiversity contribution as well, which is why Verra and Gold Standard and others were founded initially. And so essentially, Verra helped fill the gap between government negotiations and the pragmatic implementation to hasten the protection of forests. The idea is, let's pilot this, let's bring learnings on how good forest protection looks like, how it can be measured. And the first VCS project was registered in 2011. And since then, these learnings have been proven to be invaluable as forest protection gets scaled and is driven by more jurisdictional landscape approaches, implemented by government. So next slide, please. So now we want to kind of go over the technicalities of how REDD+ projects work in the voluntary carbon market beyond kind of the global climate accords. So Eddie, over to you.
Thank you, Valerie. So before entering to the most technical stuff, we wanted to just make a clear distinction about the two types of REDD activities that VCS has, Verra and the Verified Carbon Standard. So mostly they distinguish between two activities. You can have a planned REDD project or you have an unplanned REDD project. And both of them will have a big difference, and it has implications on which one you select, because that's how you determine your baseline. It will tell you how to calculate and estimate the emission reductions for each of the projects. So I will start with the planned REDD. The planned REDD, it's some of these projects will have a clear intention of deforestation, but most importantly, they have a legal authorization and a document. So this will come from an approval from the government or other body that can ensure that the land can be converted to a non-forest. So there's a land use change. A good example for these activities will be, I'm not sure how many of you know, but in the Brazilian law, there's a law saying that 20% of the land in the Amazon of each project owner or landowner, they can deforest up to 20% of that portion. So if you have the allowance to do it, that will be part of a planned REDD project, because you're trying to avoid something that it's legally authorized and documented. And going to the other part of the type activities will be totally the opposite. You will find unplanned REDD, which is other unsanctioned activities coming from deforestation agents that are doing this mostly illegally. So a good example will be people living surrounding the project or very close to the project that are accessing illegally to just get wood for their domestic purposes or uses. We will know more about the baseline and how to calculate emissions, but there's a big difference, and some of the challenges that we will discuss further in the presentation are more to the unplanned REDD. Next slide, please. Now, most of you probably know how credits are generated, but in the interest of getting to give you more information about it, I will explain about what's the baseline scenario, what is the project scenario, what are counted as displayed emissions or leakage, and some of the portions that are deduced for counting on reversals. So this is true for any other project, carbon project, but you need to account always for baseline emissions, which is, if we want to give a definition about the baseline scenario, it's basically what would have happened without the project. So it's an estimation, and going further into the future, just making a probability assessment of what will be the emissions that will be emitted to the atmosphere if you don't implement your project activities. A good example of this baseline scenario will be the same as I proposed in the previous slide. So the planned deforestation where a Brazilian landowner can cut down 20% of their land. You can account for the carbon that will be released if you do that. So those emissions that will be created for that activity. Then when you implement your project, that is called a project scenario, is just every other activity that you will do to reduce the pressure on deforestation. So a good example on this for REDD+ projects will be landowners that are using a very small portion of their project area to cut down forests, but also planting other agricultural products. So if you provide the communities or the people living inside your area with another product, then you're reducing the pressure on trees. So instead of selling the wood that you were doing previously, then you're selling other commodities, and that's changing the mindset between the products that can be beneficial for the community. This project scenario emissions will always have to be accounted, and you will see that for every report and every period when you get credits, those will have to be deducted. Other emissions that will have to be deducted will be displaced emissions. So this is based on the term that if you're protecting an area, the agents and the people that were needing the wood inside of your project area will go to other closed regions and just find other sources to get the wood. Those emissions are called leakage, and that's because you're moving what was being cut down in your project to another region, and that needs to be accounted, because if you didn't implement the project, then those emissions shouldn't happen. So to account for the number of credits, you do a difference between the baseline emissions, which is your prediction of deforestation to the future, the actual project emissions that you're getting in each period, but also the displaced emissions. And the difference between them has to be positive for you to get credit. So that's related to the graph that Saskia presented at the beginning of the presentation. But I think also Valerie will stop further in that specific topic. And also we will discuss further on the buffer pool after you get the number of credits that you can issue. All NBS projects inherently has a risk, that they have a risk of reversal. So you will deduct a percentage that it's calculated with a non-permanence risk analysis that we will present further. But it's also like an insurance cover for any potential losses that can be done in the future. Next slide, please. So now going more deeper into the technicalities of projects, we would like to present to you how the baseline scenarios are calculated and selected. With the two project activities that I presented at the beginning, as you remember, I said planned deforestation is more straightforward and easy to calculate. That's because you have a plan. You have the number of hectares that will be deforested. You have how many years that deforestation will cover. So it's very easy if you have all of that information to just change that information into the carbon that will be released into the atmosphere when you make the land use change and the deforestation activities. And basically these projects, what they're trying to do is just to halt the planned deforestation using carbon finance. So instead of cutting down the forest, you're getting and receiving carbon finance to just implement project activities to protect it. On the other side, we find that unplanned deforestation. Again, it's totally the opposite because it's very difficult to estimate. You need to predict the future deforestation because you have illegal loggers and deforestation agents that are doing this not in a constant way is not easy to calculate. And what VCS does is just asks you to select a region that is very similar to your project. We will call this the reference region. And the reference region has to be selected based on a lot of parameters that will have to match with your project area. But the most important ones will be the main agents of deforestation. So for example, we'll present a project later on that has a logging industry. So a lot of people are working on the wood industry. If you want to compare your project area with one reference region, that reference region will have to have the same agents of deforestation and the same socioeconomic parameters just to get an accurate estimation of what would have happened in the future if you don't protect your project area. Besides that, it will have to get the same accessibility, closeness to roads, biophysical parameters like the same forest type, soil conditions, slope, and others, and also the socioeconomic. So an example for this will be if your project area is being threatened by gangs, the reference region that you select to compare emissions will also have to be threatened by gangs just to compare like for like. And when you have a reference region selected, then you need to do an historical analysis. So it's just studying from 10 to 15 years what happened in the reference region in the past so that you can extrapolate and just move those emissions and project them into the future for your project area. So that's how the baseline emissions are created. And those are the ex-ante estimates that a project does just to know how many emissions are being reduced or will be reduced when the project is implemented. Next slide, please.
So as Saskia mentioned before, the baseline scenario and project scenarios are estimated in the project design document ex ante, or in other words, before the project starts. So as you can see on the right. So often when predicting the impact of a project, a developer may expect to have more impact than they actually will have. But what counts is the performance of the actual reduction in deforestation vis-a-vis the baseline, not what the project thinks it can achieve. So, for example, this is important to distinguish because when an article starts criticizing a REDD+ project, it's also important to distinguish whether or not they're comparing actual reductions versus what the project developer predicted, which oftentimes can be overly optimistic, as illustrated in the graph on the right, where you can see ex ante, meaning estimations before the project scenario versus the ex post, which is the demonstrated efficacy of the project. So another thing that we wanted to really communicate is that it's important to note that REDD+ projects don't have to eliminate deforestation completely to generate credits, but reduce deforestation vis-a-vis the baseline, which is, as Eddie mentioned, is defined through the selection of a reference area that's comparable to the project area. And the most challenging part, of course, is setting the baseline scenario, and that is at the heart of a lot of these criticisms, and that we'll get into in a couple slides. Next slide, please. But we did want to just shed light on some of these activities that we find to be really charismatic. And, so the question is, how do you even reduce pressures on the forest? And of course, it always comes down to the socioeconomic factors driving deforestation. And so when we look at projects, we look to projects that support and finance activities on the ground, which will address the heart of the drivers of deforestation. And, with the idea to do that beyond the carbon lifetime of the project, in essence, that, carbon finance is catalyzing a systemic shift in how the forest is being used and to provide value to the forest, standing rather than cut down. So some examples to reduce pressures on the forest that carbon finance is used for includes the distribution of efficient cook stoves to reduce fuel wood collection. This is a really important one to reduce degradation, increasing surrounding carbon stocks by planting or regenerating trees. An important one that we find is clarifying land tenure rights, empowering communities to have agency on the land they live on, and that way to be able to have, multiple studies show that providing property rights on something can help agents and drivers use a resource more effectively. Other examples include managing wildfire more effectively and adopting reduced impact logging and sustainable silvicultural practices. And of course, intensifying in a sustainable way the agricultural production through, for example, agroforestry to reduce agricultural expansion. And of course, to provide alternative sources of income from the forest from non-timber forest products. So all these activities are essentially examples of how a project can provide increasing value to a forest standing rather than a forest being cut down. So that is really what we look for when we're looking for projects that reduce pressures on the forest. Next slide, please.
Okay, to discuss more about the potential deductions that a project will have, we all know that the majority of the NBS projects, the nature-based solutions projects, will have the threat of reversals. That means that in the future, the emission reductions that were created in the past could be reversed due to any natural disaster or any other factors that could affect the number of credits in the past. And that's why we have the term of the buffer pool, which was created by Vera. And they have a specific rules and mechanisms to just account for the number of tons that will be used to account for these reversals. When you have to do a non-permanence risk analysis that is done at every verification period, so every time that you issue credits, you need to make a calculation about what will be the risk for your project. The buffer pool will work like an insurance cover. So the minimum contribution that you will have for your project will be 10%, even if your project is fully protected and you have all of the measures to account for these reversals. The minimum number of tons that you will have to put into the buffer pool will be 10%. So this buffer pool tons cannot be commercialized, and those will form part of the combined buffer pool of all of the NBS projects that Vera has. And today, the buffer pool account has more than 67 million credits that can be used for any reversal that happens in any other projects. And it will take into account the risks that you will see on the right side of the image. So internal risk, external risk, and any natural risk that you could have for your project.
And on that, I mean, you can tell that we're kind of focusing on Vera because Vera is the verification body that registers REDD+. Of course, other standards have other rules in terms of buffer pools. For example, Gold Standard has a standard 20% buffer pool allocation regardless of the project, whereas Vera takes a more risk-based approach bespoke to the project. It's also worth noting that Vera, the question is, a lot of people ask is what happens after the project? What happens to, possible reversals after the carbon project is registered? It is notable to note that Vera is working on digitalizing long-term monitoring of reversals beyond crediting period of projects. They actually have a working group on this, although how this is to look in practice is still being determined. But that is an ambition of the program, is to harness technologies that exist to be able to monitor those reversals and account for them through the buffer pool. Also,
may I interrupt? Because there's a quick question that's specifically about buffer pools, which is the buffer pool generic and available to all, as opposed to specific to each project?
Well, for Vera right now, it's specific to different projects, and under Gold Standard, it's a generic pool.
Thank you.
But this is to say it's not static. Pooled buffer accounts is a topic of priority for the Integrity Council for the voluntary carbon market, whereby there's debate around what does a good buffer pool look like at a program level, and what are some mechanisms that we can incorporate into the voluntary carbon market, such as insurance products, for example, to ensure permanence. This isn't the subject of the webinar, but it is something to be looked out for in Q3. Later this year, the ICVCM will be publishing their latest framework on sort of, what integrity looks like and how a program and a project can get that label. Next slide, please. So going towards, that was an overview of Vera, sort of how it works. And now we want to, of course, address challenges and the way forward, at least in terms of REDD+ in the voluntary carbon space. Next slide, please. So we have to, discuss the fact that, today's challenges REDD+ are the following. we know that predicting what will happen in the future is very difficult, even when it's scientifically informed. But in order to assess performance, there is a need to look at some sort of historical data of a control site or plot as it stands today. And the technicalities on how best to do this needs to evolve to include the learnings from the past 10 years. Another challenge is that each project has its own inherent unique attributes, as Eddie was saying, and specific socioeconomic factors driving deforestation. And this is why there are multiple methodologies under Verra. So if you're to register a REDD+ project, I think there are about 8 or so that you can choose from. And so the development of these different methodologies was a way to enable developers to integrate local factors into their projects. But this comes with a confusing applicability criteria and confusing rules between methodologies. And it basically means that no 2 REDD+ projects are comparable. So another challenge is, needing to fixing the baseline for 10 years is an ambitious timeline. So as the rules stand today, you look at the historical deforestation of the reference period for avoided unplanned deforestation, and you fix that for 10 years. As we know, that's really ambitious, as political and regulatory changes have considerable impacts during that time, whether that is positive or negative in terms of impact and deforestation. Also something to note is when projects first registered, there were varying satellite imagery and sources available. What was available in 2011 is not necessarily, is a far cry from what's available today. So because there are varying satellite imagery and sources between geographic regions and time periods, for example, cloud cover or resolution, over the years, we've definitely have increasing access to more cost-effective and better technologies, and we should capitalize on those. So there is a need for more accountability and integrity and to reintegrate kind of the learnings from the past 10 years. And so, next slide, please. The question is what's actually happening and how is that actually, looking like at Verra and at the market level. So we thought it was important to, contextualize what's actually happening at the standard and what we see as trends happening in the market. So of course, over time, science has shown that you need to revise your baseline more frequently. And that has been the conclusions of, the overall conclusions of the various articles criticizing REDD+, because circumstances, politics change, as do demand for different commodities. So as such, the baselining frequency has reduced from 10 to 6 years as a start, and that's a program-wide change across Verra. There's also going to be a unified methodology, and Verra is transitioning all projects into that unified methodology to address kind of the multitude of methodologies and kind of the complexities that come with it. And that will be important because that's going to integrate some of the lessons learned over the past decade. And so, of course, when Verra changes something, they're very inclusive, and a lot of stakeholders are around the table, and anyone can put inputs on this, including ourselves, to shape the program in a way that is done around consensus. So that is also a little bit of the challenges at Verra, is that it does take time for these rules to change because they want to make sure it's done in a transparent and collaborative way. Thirdly, Verra is now taking on what we call jurisdictional level to reference areas. So before, Eddie was mentioning project-specific reference areas where it was up to the project developer to develop a reference area and also to justify the use of that reference area through the different social, economic parameters and the physical characteristics of that reference area. But now those reference areas will be done at a jurisdictional level. So basically, the same approach will be taken across the jurisdiction. So that could be a county, a region, a country level to assess deforestation risks. And that all will be done by third-party service providers that Verra is selecting. So basically, the final version of these modules on how to do that will be published in March. And so this means that projects will start to integrate project level activities with the jurisdiction and help government programs to be supported and to deploy forest conservation at scale. Because basically the challenge is you want to make sure that you're assessing deforestation risk in a harmonious way between 2 projects. And that will really fill the gap that we see today, and that no 2 projects are really that comparable because they're very bespoke. And so finally, kind of, a bit about the evolutions on the market that we see that are bolstering integrity and transparency beyond what Verra is doing. We see that market participants are definitely actively involved in creating, more innovative approaches to carbon, such as dynamic baselining. We do see that dynamic baselining using some control plots is already being incorporated into other Vera methodologies, such as the afforestation reforestation methodology that's due to come out in the middle of this year, and such as improved forest management. But we do see actors that are, harnessing their own technologies and analysis to inform the debate on this, which is really, really good to see. And we, of course, we see value in bringing all those learnings, technologies, and debates into the industry. And so we definitely think that, this is going to only level up the assurance of integrity. But we may be a ways from including dynamic baselining into REDD+, given the timescales and the ambition of it, but it's definitely a trend that is ongoing. And another trend that we see is that REDD+ projects have provided invaluable insights on learnings for wider programs as they become nested within government programs. And so, we're learning about what works well, what doesn't work well for forest protection. And of course, there are some new technologies coming out for digitalization of monitoring, reporting, and finally, open debate from the Integrity Council that is giving, more input and insight in what integrity kind of looks like. Next slide, please. So as we explained earlier, we want to address the recent Guardian article, which is an example of, criticism that we've come across REDD+ projects. So, projects often overestimate what they will deliver, but, over time, ideally, this is corrected as they're monitored and over time as they reevaluate their baselines. But it's right, to question projects and to understand where that comes from. And so there are regular media articles about this because REDD+ projects are inherently kind of piloting what, intergovernmental negotiations are trying to scale up at a governmental level. So you may have seen kind of, the recent Guardian article on this project, questioning the baseline and carbon performance on a number of REDD+ projects. So with such complexity, there is scope to have findings either misinterpreted or miscommunicated. And while there are some really valid conclusions in this article, such as, a call for more frequent baselining, etc., there are some fundamental issues that we wanted our clients to be aware of before taking the headline as face value. So we also want to let you know that there was a technical review that was published by Vera, specifically on those three projects. Sorry, not three projects, three studies that we really encourage you to read, but Eddie will give kind of a high-level overview of what those technical review issues demonstrated.
And I'm just going to jump in and give a very quick time check. I think this is scheduled to go until 1:45. So please start putting your questions in. We'll follow up if we're not able to do it. We might be able to continue for an extra couple of minutes afterwards, but typically we like to try and keep to time, and there's a lot of detail here. Eddie.
Thank you, Saskia. All right, so just to give you some context on the Guardian article, this was released a couple of weeks ago, and it actually included 3 scientific papers, as Valerie mentioned. We found key issues with those, so we like to split them into the underlying studies and what was reported by the Guardian. So we found that the scientific papers use very simplistic parameters. We know that if you only compare biophysical parameters and accessibility to projects, that's not the same if you're leaving out the deforestation agents. So that's something that we found the scientific papers didn't count on it. So it's actually, you're not comparing like for like because you're not taking into account who is the driver of the deforestation in a synthetic control. So the methodology that this scientific papers use, just to give you some information about it, was selecting other areas that could represent the project area and compare the exposed after the project started deforestation, comparing to what was estimated by the project. We also found that the underlying data was just inaccurate. The scientific papers use some softwares and tools that don't have the resolution needed to account for deforestation. So the results that were obtained in those scientific papers are not accurately or statistically significant. And also we found that the 3 of them have inconsistent conclusions about the same projects because 2 scientific papers used a different resolution and other method than the 3rd one. They will have very big differences in terms of the deforestation that was accounted for each of the projects. So one of the conclusions that we found from the Guisar-Coutinho or the Cambridge study, that was one of the 3 scientific papers, is that one of the conclusions from them was that REDD+ projects actually works, and they reduced deforestation in about 47% in the first 5 years. That's something that wasn't mentioned even on the Guardian article, but it's an accepted response and accepted conclusion that we found was omitted by the reporting on the Guardian article. And then the issues with the reporting, if you read the scientific papers, you will know that the majority, or the 3 of them, acknowledges the limitations that they have. They mention point by point the lack of accepting and evaluating the deforestation agents and others. Those were not presented into the Guardian article. But also, as mentioned on the last conclusion of the Cambridge study, that study actually found the reduction of deforestation, which is something that was not included on the Guardian article. It didn't include all of the positive impact that the projects have on deforestation. And lastly, the majority of the numbers and the estimations that the Guardian article used are coming from the 3rd scientific paper that is actually not peer-reviewed. So it's grabbing the majority of the information, and you cannot be sure if that hasn't been reviewed by the scientific community. But the important thing on this, the Guardian article and the scientific papers, is that all of them will call for a more frequent baselining, consolidating jurisdictional baseline, or doing something more precise in terms of estimated future deforestation, which is something that, as Valerie mentioned, BERA is already underway on working, and something to implement for future projects. Next slide, please. Just to present you some case, we are studying a Brazilian REDD+ projects that was criticized by one of the 3 scientific papers. So you will see the graph on your right. That's what was included on the scientific paper. The orange line will represent the amount of emissions that was estimated by the project before it started. So you see that increasing line. And then the scientific paper selected a synthetic control that was for them very similar to the project area, just to evaluate what was the deforestation after the project started. So you see that that synthetic control area, or what was compared to the project, didn't have any deforestation. It has a blue line in 0, which when we evaluate the project area in Google Earth images and satellite images, you will see that there's a pressure on deforestation just surrounding the project area. And that's because they didn't account on the deforestation agents. So this is the project that I mentioned before. There was a logging industry and a wood industry in that region in Brazil. And some studies confirmed that the majority of the wood comes from illegal loggers, because the legal loggers that are on the region don't have the capacity to fulfill the demand of the wood in that region. Next slide, please.
This is just a quick overview that we do screen our carbon projects. We have a rigorous process internally where we look not only at the carbon attributes of a project, we also look at the social benefits, and not only social benefits, but also the risks that come with the project. So, you know, even if a REDD+ project, for example, we find to be have carbon integrity, we will not contract with that project if we think that there are some social issues such as grievances or displacement risks, etc. So this is just kind of a quick overview on whenever we start working with a project developer, we look at derogatory information searches, we have a risk assessment and qualification step, then and only then do we start doing our technical due diligence screening, where we'll start assessing things like additionality, baselining, permanence, and etc. And then once that passes, then we'll do a KYC to ensure that, you know, we know who we're working with, and ensuring that there's no fundamental issues with any, you know, related entities of the project developer. And only then do we start contracting and developing relationship management. So across each of these steps, you know, obviously projects fail for various reasons, and it's, you know, a continually evolving process that we have in place as, you know, we learn more about the various tools and mechanisms to evaluate projects from both a technical side, but also from a social benefit side. And perhaps on the last slide, before we go into Q&A, we did have to glean over a little bit on the technicalities of things, but again, we encourage you to look at the technical summary of Vera that does a really good overview on the different scientific, not flaws of their approach and the shortcomings of their approach. But basically, the key points we wanted to drive home today was that, well, REDD+ is a framework that emerged from the UNFCCC, and the voluntary carbon market kind of pioneered the implementation of these projects to hasten forest protection. And it's only been about 10 years. So REDD+ projects have inherent challenges, and we know that. And they have brought invaluable learnings to how to feed in to make REDD projects more effective, both at a project level and at a jurisdictional level. And this is also why we're very selective about the projects that we support personally to our clients. Of course, technicalities on baselining and jurisdictional approaches are actively being rehauled at Vera, and they're being informed by the different trends on the market, on the market side. And we really wanted to communicate that when reviewing criticisms of REDD+, it's crucial to understand the underlying assumptions and data sources, as Eddie was saying, on the satellite data, on the assumptions of the parameters of deforestation, because it is a very complex topic. And despite these challenges, multiple studies do show that REDD+ projects do reduce deforestation and are effective nonetheless. So, in our view, we must maintain finance for these important projects while it's evolving and improving to empower countries and communities to protect these forests. So hopefully this was useful for some insight onto REDD+ and the different challenges that come with it.
Valerie, you just answered one of the questions that has come in, which is, should I be using credits from REDD projects towards meeting my climate goals? You just said that, I think, in our view.
Oh, yeah, of course. I mean, because, of course, I mean, otherwise, for example, some people ask us if reforestation is not a better alternative. Well, we know that reforestation alone can't achieve, global climate goals, and reducing deforestation is essential. We know this because, intact or primary forests hold carbon and biodiversity attributes that fundamentally are irreplaceable, that a secondary forest just can't provide. And we also know that there's not enough land to sequester all that carbon. So, imagine for every hectare of forest you lose today, it will take decades and decades and decades, maybe a couple 100 years for that secondary forest to get back the same carbon and biodiversity benefits as the original forest. So it's also, REDD is an interesting one. As you said, Saskia, it addresses the 17 sustainable development goals. So when REDD+ is, about addressing underlying socioeconomic drivers of deforestation. So it's, a multitude of benefits whenever you support a REDD+ project.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Valerie and Eddie. Another question that has come in that I might take the liberty, being the moderator, of answering is that, when you see articles like this, and I read The Guardian and I read a lot of papers, so when you see articles like this, it can be unsettling. And especially for a lot of the companies that we work with, we know that the people we're working directly with also have all of their colleagues working. So the question is, what do you do about them and how do you find out more? And I think what we have been thinking about is, you need to understand who's writing it and what might their agenda be. But you also need to try and understand what are the facts, so you can reach out to organizations like us, look at the standards bodies, find out additional information there. Your account managers will be able to help you provide links to latest research and hopefully be very proactive on any details that are fact-based. But what Valerie and Eddie have shared, and what I thought was very important is, when you're buying credit and offsetting it against your baseline, that has been verified and that reduction has occurred in the past. It's not about the future prediction of what might happen. So there's that kind of analysis that is very important. But these projects are hard to deliver. They are pioneering. It's quite young still in this market. They are in very hard to reach communities around the world. There are challenges, and thankfully we have new technologies and new information systems and new data that can help improve the quality. And we have to have open dialogue, face up to these challenges and push for the continual improvement. What is very clear is if the finance dries up, then there isn't this protection going on. And we are all looking for, global agreement and accord and policies that will help conserve these areas. But in the meantime, this remains a very viable solution to conserve and protect and reduce forest degradation and deforestation. So let's not let a desire for the perfect stand in the way of the good. Let's keep supporting these and increasing REDD projects and supporting the upgraded methodologies. And with that, I think I'm going to bring this webinar to a close. Thank Valerie and Eddie, and we'll follow up with any unanswered questions. Oh yes, thank you for reminding me. There is a survey. If you have a couple of extra minutes, we would really appreciate some feedback on how useful this was for you. Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.